Reading Isaiah. Well, that's what we have been doing so far this quarter, and we're already a month into it. And it was thought by the Sabbath School team that it's one thing to read Isaiah, but it's another thing to interpret it. And so the team thought it was advisable for me to outline some principles of biblical interpretation that we could apply to our study of the book of Isaiah. We already have looked at some of these when we stepped outside of the book and looked in at it, and I will revise and review these very briefly, just for a few minutes, to remind us of what they were. But then we will move on to new material, where we will step inside the book of Isaiah and walk amongst its pages and amongst its texts. So, in order to examine these principles that are applicable to the study of the book of the Bible, when some people open the Bible, they ask the question, or this question really is in the forefront of everyone's mind. What does it mean? What's the text mean? What's it saying? What's it about? And this question is comparatively easy to answer, believe it or not, when it comes to the narrative portions of Scripture, and we've discussed what some of those are, the Gospels, the histories. But it's not so easy when it comes to the prophets or the wisdom books, like Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, the book of Job, or to apocalyptic prophetic books, such as Daniel and Revelation. And it's also not so easy when it comes to the prophetic books such as Isaiah. And Isaiah is one of these prophetic books. So it isn't easy to find the meaning. In order to arrive at the meaning, it implies moving through a process. We can't just pick it up and read it and say, oh, I know what that means, because we probably won't be right. We need to put it through a process, and it's that process that I would like to introduce you to now. And here is the process that we would recommend that we follow. First of all, the process begins with a series of questions. And I will answer the questions as I ask them, because I have a very limited period of time to do this. So we may keep Isaiah in mind as we answer the question. So I'd like you to think Isaiah, think what you've been studying this quarter so far, think about the content as you know it to this point in time, and focus on Isaiah in answer to these questions. In actual fact, the questions can apply to any of the books of the Bible. Whatever one we come to study, we can apply these same questions to it. If you kind of get this fixed in your mind, then any time we do a biblical study, as in study one of the books of the Bible for our Sabbath school lesson, you'll already be set up to approach it in the best possible way. So question number one. What is the book's place in larger history? Where does it fit in terms of the history of the whole of Scripture? Is it part of the Pentateuch? Is it part of the histories of the prophets? Is it part of the prophetic ministry of the later prophets? Is it in the New Testament and dealing with the life of Jesus, or the epistles as written mostly by Paul? Whereabouts does it fit in history? And so you can answer that in terms of Isaiah. And you can say it's set during the time of ancient Israel. Next question, is it Old or New Testament? Well, I think you know that one, it's Old Testament. Where in the Old Testament or the New Testament does it appear? Well, we've learned that it appears amongst the major prophets. So to what era does it belong? It belongs to the era of the divided kingdom. And who wrote it? Well, Isaiah wrote it. And when did he write it? I think by now we probably know that he wrote in the late 8th, early 7th century BCE. To whom did he write? He wrote to the inhabitants of the city of Jerusalem in Judah. And we've learned that so far as well. See how much you already know. We know all this. We're just reviewing it. So what was the cultural background of his audience? And this is a little bit tricky. You have to move back into history to know that when the land of Canaan was divided up amongst the tribes, Judah got a whacking great big portion. Too big for Judah. So Judah shared it with Benjamin and with Simeon. So the territory known as Judah really comprehends the three tribes, Judah, Benjamin, and Simeon. So what kind of literature is the book? And we've already asked the questions if it's narrative, epistle, wisdom, or apocalyptic prophecy. And we came down on the understanding, last time I spoke to you a month ago, that the book of Isaiah is classical prophecy. Now, what is there about classical prophecy? Well, it's conditional. It may or it may not turn out to be the way the prophet has prophesied it would. And that depends on the response of the people, how the people relate to his message, and how touched they are by it, how they decide about it. Are they going to follow Yahweh after all? Or are they going to go on their merry way with their paganism and their worship of idols? This kind of thing is all inherent in the book of Isaiah. So really, whether or not Isaiah's prophecies are going to be fulfilled in exactly the way he spells them out is dependent on the people's response. We call that conditional prophecy. Classical prophecy fits into that category. So all the other prophets, major and minor, fit into this as well, except for Daniel, if you see him as being amongst the major prophets, which some question. Others have him amongst the wisdom, but that's another thing. Okay, how is the book written? What kind of literature is it? Well, we discovered it was written mostly in poetry, with just a touch of prose in it. 10%, in fact, 90% was poetry. The original language of the writing of Isaiah, it was written in classical Hebrew. But there's one significant thing we need to know about it. By the time you get to the New Testament, the classical Hebrew of the Old Testament, including the book of Isaiah, has given way to a Greek translation. The word, for those who want to know it, is Septuagint. So the Septuagint translation of the Old Testament, that is from the classical Hebrew, which nobody spoke anymore, into Greek, is within the Septuagint. And why is this significant? Why does it matter? Because the Septuagint is the Bible. The Septuagint is the version of the New Testament writers. So when they quote to you from the Old Testament, they're quoting in Greek from the Septuagint by and large. And that's important for us to remember when it comes to looking at the in-depth study of the internals of the book of Isaiah. So now we're ready to open the book of Isaiah and to examine its content. So what do we call the content of any book of the Bible? We call it the text. And that's different from a verse. We sometimes refer to a verse as being a text, and that's okay, we can do that, there's nothing wrong with it. But just in order for us to get a clear picture, the text is the whole of the writing of a book. And one numbered little section is a verse. If you keep on referring to it as a text, that's fine, nobody will be upset. But just so it's clear in our own minds, that is the difference. So in order to ascertain the meaning of the text, we need to also put it through this process. So what do we need to do? So we need to have a way of treating this text. And the first thing we can do is to select a passage within the text. So we're not going to understand or find meaning in the whole, particularly when it's 66 verses long, unless we're only looking for a survey. And, you know, there have been times in the discussion of our Sabbath school lesson here where a survey has been part of what a teacher has presented, and good for them because they're valuable things, those surveys. But we're not looking so much for meaning in a survey. We want to look for meaning in a selected passage. So we select the passage. And the first thing we do with this passage, once we have selected one, is to note its immediate context. Now let me just pick on a passage. We had a lesson a couple of weeks ago. I think Pastor Neil was our teacher that day. And he took us to Isaiah chapter 7 and verses 1 through 14. And within that text, within that passage, you've got toward the end in verse 14, you've got a declaration of this child who was going to be born, who would be born of a young woman or a virgin, whichever translation you prefer, and that he would be named Emmanuel, which means in the Hebrew, God is with us. You remember that text. It's one that we love, that text, because we very readily see its messianic implications. But now, you know, how are we going to know very much about this text? Well, the way is to examine the words that go before it, the words that come after it. That tells us the context, tells us where it's set, what it's going to probably mean. and is an important part of the beginning of examining the passage. So read the passage closely. I find that we miss out on doing this, and it's one thing I really learned well when I did PhD study in Bible study, as I was very privileged to be able to do. I learned to read the text closely. Don't miss any of the words. Don't miss any of even the punctuation, although that's not inspired. But don't miss bits because you're looking for something else. And I find that we do that a bit. We're looking for something specific in the text and we're going to find it, and we gloss over or miss the detail. So we need to read the text closely, word by word. Don't miss any of it. Better to have a smaller passage than a larger one in order to be able to do this. And in the process, we note the detail. We're looking for the kind of vocabulary that is used. We're looking for a list of key words. And we're marking any that are repeated. Why are these words said over and over again? What's so important about them? Why are they a key to our understanding of the passage? Then, thirdly, we need to read other relevant scripture passages. In the case of Isaiah, the relevant scripture passages, of course, come to us from the books of 1st and 2nd Kings and 1st and 2nd Chronicles. These books give us a nice, easy to follow narrative style background to what is against which the prophecy of Isaiah is cast. When you come to Isaiah itself, it's not so easy to understand or to know just what it's all about in every word at first reading. But Chronicles and Kings gives the background, the historical background, and some of the reasons why Isaiah prophesied the way he did when we understand and read those historical backgrounds. So in this way, reading other scripture that impinges upon the book we're studying is really important for us to do. It helps us in our quest to gather meaning. And another thing about reading 2nd Chronicles, 1st and 2nd Chronicles, 1st and 2nd Kings in relationship to Isaiah is that it is also inspired material. So where are you going to get an inspired commentary on something that's in Scripture? This is an excellent example of where you get that. You have this inspired commentary on the book that you're actually trying to understand, even though it isn't that easy to understand. And where English only is available to a reader, it's advisable to compare versions to get a better understanding of the original intent of the author. So that's another step to take, or another thing to do, compare versions. And be careful with versions. Some, can I call them translations rather than versions of Scripture, are written with an intent to help us understand readily what it's about. And the language that is used is modern, contemporary language, and it moves further and further away from the original meaning of the Hebrew in Isaiah's case, Greek in the case of a New Testament book. So we need to find versions that are reliably close in their translation to the original in which the author wrote. And I would suggest the New King James Version, the RSV, certainly the NNIV. Some of these are bolted to the original language, and so they can't wander too far away from it, even though they will render it in an understandable way to the English-only reader. So that's an important thing for us to do, to compare versions, but not to wander off into these that are too contemporary and depart too far from the original. If you do that, you lose what the original is meant to say and what the author intended from it. Okay, so where are we now? So the original was written by the author, who is translated from Hebrew, Aramaic, or Greek. Nobody is rendered from English into English in the Bible, unfortunately. It's going to be one step away from the original language, which is not connected at all to English. We have to remember that as we do our Bible study. So next, the next step that we want to take, and I think these are all coming up, thanks to Bob up there. Thank you so much, Bob. You're right with me here. the next step to take is to look for some resources that are going to help shed light on the text, going to shed light on the passage that we have selected to read. And these resources would be commentaries, they would be Bible dictionaries, Bible encyclopedias, and articles. Now, the good news is that the public domain on the internet is chockers with this stuff. You can find all sorts of very enriching, helpful commentaries, dictionaries, articles on specific areas of Bible study that you may be puzzling over or wanting to draw meaning from, and are working through this process in order to be able to do that in the end. It would be a pity to avoid these extra resources. They have been written by people who do know the original languages. They're written by people who have, in many cases, studied and taught for decades in the area in which they're writing the article or have made the contribution to the commentary. And so it would be a pity to avoid reading these or not to think it's not necessary. Really, it is quite an important part of Bible study. And they can deliver insights to us, and we have aha moments. I didn't realize that that was in there. I didn't realize that that's how you could see it. And so these insights are very enlightening. I love biblical study aha moments. They kind of give you a buzz. And so you can find those by utilizing the other materials as they come. And as you find them on the internet. As I say, public domain, you don't even have to pay for them. So we need to also note the use of the passage elsewhere in Scripture, this same passage. Who else in the Bible is quoting this passage? I was looking last night at two aspects that said the same thing right within the book of Isaiah in relationship to what Luke takes up and describes through the mouth of Jesus what would be his ministry. This kind of thing is very valuable. And, we already saw in the New Testament, Matthew 1:23, how Matthew used the description of the Emmanuel child that would be born as a close description of Jesus, who would come and fulfill the God is with us promise. So now we're ready for interpretation. I've only got 3 things to say here, and then I will sit down. We've gathered all our data. We've done it through this process. Each one of these points are important for us to follow. So we've finished gathering the data, and now we've collected it. And so this leads us to ascertain the meaning. In the first instance, we need to know, what did the passage or the text mean to Isaiah and his contemporaries? Question number 1. We call this primary application. It doesn't mean primary in the most important sense. It means first, the first application. Like when you go to primary school, it's not the most important part of your education necessarily, although primary teachers would disagree with me on that. It does lay a foundation, and it's the same with this. The primary interpretation lays a foundation for the understanding of later, secondary, tertiary applications or understandings that might be gleaned and derived from the text. So we need to know, and I notice there's a bit of a dearth here, whenever a Sabbath school teacher asks us as a group for input, that means we really need to understand something of the primary application of the book. We say nothing. Why? Because we don't know. So here's a little hole in our education, an area where we really need to get to and work with this primary application to see what it means. Then we need to remember the New Testament use of the text, if any, and what does the text mean for us today? They're the other 2 areas. So a contemporary application of the text to us, and the New Testament helps us to see how to do this, because like in Matthew, who took from Isaiah, he made an application to the birth of Jesus about a child who was really born 700 years before the birth of Jesus, but nonetheless, it fitted so well that Matthew could take it and use it. And so we need to do this. We need to say, what does the text mean for us today, living now, 2021, here on the Central Coast? What application does it have for us? Don't go straight to that. And if you're a Sabbath school teacher, please don't go straight to that. Deal with the primary first. We owe it to our classes to do that. And finally, this is the highly subjective question, which people do come to readily because it comes out of their own experience rather than out of knowledge. But what does the text mean to me personally? How can I legitimately interpret it for my own life? And that's a legitimate question. I mean, what relevance is there in Scripture if it cannot apply to me personally? But again, don't go straight to that. And when a Sabbath school class teacher says, now, what does this mean to you? Say to the person, the teacher, have we really dealt with the primary application yet? Or have we talked about what it means to us as a community? I'm really happy to say what it means to me personally, but what benefit is that to the group? And what benefit is that to, people at large? And how does it help us understand the setting in Scripture out of which this text is drawn? So, I'm being a little bit confrontational here. I want us to think about this. It's not all about me. It's not all about what this text means to me, although that's an important part of it. And it has no relevance at all if it doesn't have a relevance to me, ultimately. So we need to have all of that in mind.